Nosferatu, written and directed by Robert Eggers, is the first film I've seen in 2025, and definitely not one I'll forget anytime soon.
Come to me.
Some people seem to love the film, others have come away underwhelmed, and then there are those like the teenagers sat a few seats away from me in my screening, who were rustling popcorn, fidgeting and whispering the entire time because they had no idea what was happening. The film is, of course, an adaptation of the 102-year-old German silent horror classic, directed by F.W. Murnau, which was itself both an unauthorised adaptation and the oldest surviving film adaptation of Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula. The presentation, as anyone familiar with Eggers' previous work would expect, is incredible. From the costumes to the production design to the lighting to the cinematography, Nosferatu is visually impeccable and immersive to a degree that should prompt legitimate animosity if the crew does not get the extensive awards recognition they deserve, even in a year as stacked as this. The only shot where I noticed any kind of obvious, distracting digital effects enhancement was in the final act when characters are standing outside in the snow holding up flaming torches. The sound design, on the other hand, was flawless. There are so many instances where the work of the sound engineers and the editors helped to create some of the film's most haunting visuals.
There is a devil in this world and I have met him.
But you could never please me as he could.
Skarsgård's voice may initially seem overwhelming, but within his first scene it becomes evident that this crew has captured a performance that embodies the essence of a walking nightmare. Even with the knowledge that it was him underneath the prosthetics, there was no point where I could have otherwise identified it was him. He was consistently disgusting, disturbing, and more than lived up to the incredible technical stage Eggers and the crew set up.
It's the scariest performance of my career. I've never been more scared in playing a character.
I understand they're doing something very different with their performances, but this makes Gary Oldman's Dracula look even more hilarious than it already was by comparison. I grew up with Nicholas Hoult, not literally, but from studying about a boy in high school to watching him play the original Nate Jacobs, aka Tony Stoneham in Skins, an awful show that co-starred multiple other people that would go on to be huge stars, as well as a load of people who would correctly choose to abandon acting altogether. I thought his performance in the film was very believable, and though he spent most of his time cowering in fear, he came across as genuinely petrified in a way that this character has never been portrayed in the past, only further accentuating the terrifying shadow Orlok casts over this town and its inhabitants.
I'm blown away by the accuracy of the recreation of all these historical things that make the world so authentic, and even down to the fine details like Orlok's crypt.
Orlok's coffin is quite spectacular. It's based on lots of research of mainly Polish coffins. The real ones like have skulls on the side of them, you know, and like how sick is that?
I'm of two minds about Lily Rose Depp's portrayal of Ellen, and where exactly to place the blame for my issues with her performance. With more than enough justification as Orlok burrows his way into her consciousness, she spends about 20% of her time on screen undergoing seizures. Obviously, I'm not saying seizures are something to be laughed at, but there was usually something about the way her eyes would roll back and she would begin to repeatedly shake that I could never take all that seriously. I wouldn't even mention this if there weren't so many examples of other films that do almost this exact same thing, but whether it was the directing, editing, or the performance itself in these other examples, I didn't find myself quite so taken out of the tone they'd established up to that point. To an extent, I felt the same way about a few of her line deliveries early on, but as the film continued, I think I began to appreciate her character a lot more and question whether my opinion would change if I ever saw the film again, which I certainly intend to.
I mean, there's so many facets to her that were so exciting to me. I think also knowing that Rob has wanted to make this for so long, the character, you know, in the script, she was already written with so much complexity, with like so much nuance and just like so much to dive into. She's suffering from much more than I think, you know, people at the time or men at the time were willing to deal with, and you see that in how some of the characters treat her.
I would largely say the same of Aaron Taylor-Johnson and Emma Corrin. They sometimes felt slightly wooden, even lacking conviction in their line deliveries, at least when compared to the likes of Nicholas Hoult and the rest of the cast. The child actors obviously weren't great, but Eggers definitely knows how to direct kids of this age. A couple of their lines did kind of sound like they were recorded ADR, but it could have just been how bad the setup was in my screening room at Odeon. Willem Dafoe, as always, steals every scene he's in, and at this point I'll be disappointed if there's ever a new release from either Robert Eggers or Yorgos Lanthimos without him at the very least in a supporting role.
What keeps you working together?
He gives me fun stuff to do.
I guess the only thing that stops me from loving Nosferatu is the story at the heart of it. Dracula has been adapted dozens and dozens of times, and while this film delves into bold and impressive new territory in terms of its thematic focus, I found myself struggling to become heavily invested in a story I've never really connected with all that much to begin with. The elements I connected most with all happened to be moments where it deviated most starkly from the source material. Obviously, this film focused much more on Ellen than Thomas, and despite my nitpicks with her performance and praises of Nicholas Holt's performance, I'm definitely glad this decision was made, and I think this is a large part of what makes the film feel so refreshing when compared to previous adaptations.
I thought it would just be much more exciting if it is her story the whole time, and to kind of see that there were traces of Dracula and Nosferatu that were like a demon lover motif, and to go further with that, where you have this relationship and then the demon disappears and then he returns. And that would be a nice way to tell the story.
It's interesting to see all the layers of underlying sexual themes and subtext that have been extracted from the source material, now explored with such overt focus and depth. It's not a criticism, but I guess something that I didn't really notice, or I was just so distracted by the sounds of those teenagers, or songs from Wicked playing in the adjacent screening room, but the musical score didn't particularly stand out to me. In spite of the distractions, I really did enjoy Nosferatu, and I would definitely watch the film again once it comes out on streaming platforms. But for now, I would give the film a 7 out of 10. When it ended, right after Orlok shrivels up and dies, one of the teenagers turned to their friend and unironically asked, "Did the vampire die?" When he said that, something died inside of me.